All right, welcome back to Thoughts of War. My name is Bart. This is my series on early Christianity and nonviolence. If you've not watched my previous videos in this series, please go back and watch those. I've already done a Justin Martyr Part 1, Part 2. I've done Irenaeus Part 1. Now I'm on Irenaeus Part 2. So today we're actually going to look at the Against Heresies, and we're actually going to address it. In the last video, Part 1, we did his apostolic preaching. And so just the same thing about him. He listed the bishops. So from basically the first 12 bishops of Rome, he listed them. He actually, as a youth, saw Polycarp, who was actually instructed by apostles, which I thought was pretty neat. And also, just interesting that Polycarp also was instructed by John. So today we're going to look in specifically Book 4, Chapter 34. Now, this is the proof against Marcionites that the prophet referred in all their predictions to our Christ. So, one, this is actually Book 4 of the Against Heresies. So this is where he's addressing all the different heresies that the church is combating at that time. And so this one, he's particularly referencing, there was a teacher named Marcion, and Marcion taught that the Old Testament God was different from the New Testament God. And so he's trying to straighten them out. So we're going to jump straight into there. And so here we go. Now he's going to use the same verses Justin Martyr used. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. And he's going to go back and use that. So if you notice at the very beginning, well, let's jump straight to what I've got highlighted there in bold. It says, but from the Lord's advent, the new covenant which brings back peace, and the law which gives life has gone forth over the whole earth, as the prophet said. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall rebuke many people, and they shall break down their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, and they shall no longer learn to fight. So, again, this is where an early Christian is given proof that Jesus was the Messiah. How do you know Jesus was the Messiah? By the impact his teachings had on people's lives. And so some might have said, hey, this prophecy, one, had already been fulfilled. Well, you can always ask, when was this prophecy fulfilled? Because there was never anything like this. There was never a teaching that came from Jerusalem that made such an impact of people not wanting to kill other people, of actually laying down their swords. Nothing else has ever happened like that. There's been lots of people who've claimed to be the Messiah. Lots of people said they were the Jewish Messiah. Only one person made a difference in the lives of all those Christians throughout the entire Roman Empire. Either before the Roman Empire or even after the Roman Empire, there's no one who's made the difference like Jesus' teachings have made. And so he's offering this as proof. Again, just like Justin Martyr, he wouldn't be saying this if there was just a few Christians that believed this. But this tells us that even by the end of the 2nd century, towards the end of the 2nd century, most Christians had turned their swords into plowshares, and it was actually fulfilling this prophecy. They had taken the teachings that were from the apostles and applied them to no longer train to fight. Now, we're about to see that Irenaeus is going to give us a little bit more information than what Justin Martyr gave us. And so I'm going to jump straight through. So the stuff in between that's not bold is stuff that Justin Martyr has pretty much already mentioned. But look at the very bottom that I got highlighted. It says that they are now unaccustomed to fighting, but when smitten, offer also the other cheek. Then the prophets have not spoken these things of any other person, but of him who affected them. So this is the first time that this has linked this prophecy, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, with Matthew chapter 5, with the Sermon on the Mount. And so when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, he's actually talking about someone who has laid down their swords, have turned their swords into plowshares. And so sometimes you would hear someone say, well, when Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, he's just talking about someone who insults you. And when someone insults you, you're supposed to just kind of take it, turn the other cheek. you're not really supposed to let them do any physical harm to you or anything like that. But we're about to get to that in the next little section here. But here, Irenaeus is actually saying that now that you've taken your sword, you've beaten to a plowshare, you're actually even letting someone strike you on the cheek, and you're not responding the way just our human nature would respond, which is hit the other guy back or take out your sword and kill them. So now Irenaeus does some things weird here. If you had time, go back and really read this particular section, but I just want you to notice he starts referencing back to Adam and Abel. Think back to the way the world was designed by God. It was designed to have a garden. Adam was designed to live in a garden. What do gardeners have? They have plowshares. They have pruning hooks. Interesting. What Jesus is doing is he is returning mankind back to the way mankind was supposed to be. When those who come to follow Christ, he's changing us back to the way we were designed to be. Not to be people who killed, not to be ones who kill one another, but to actually be back to the way Adam was as a gardener. However, we still live in a fallen world. So we're not so much like Adam as we're kind of like Abel. What I mean by Abel is that Abel was a righteous man, which is what Christ is forming us into. But Abel was killed. And that's what happens to, unfortunately, to many of the Christians in this world. They're like Abel. They end up being killed by their brothers, their fellow mankind. But you notice it says, has reclaimed the savage earth. So he's using us as farmers to reclaim the earth. This earth is savage. A farmer has to fight right now to get that earth to where he can use it. He has to plow it. He has to cut weeds. He has to prune vines. And so a farmer has to work. And that's the way with us Christians. But the work we're doing is spiritual work. And in a sense, we're preparing this earth. We're reclaiming it for Christ, but we're doing it through a non-violent method with plowshares and pruning hooks. And then look at this at the very end. It says, these things were acted beforehand in Abel, were also previously declared by the prophets, but were accomplished in the Lord's person, and the same is still true with regard to us, the body following the example of the head. So that's our example when it comes to nonviolence. We're following the way Christ lived. Now, some of you may look back and you say, hey, I got some verses. What about Matthew chapter 10? What about Luke 22 when Jesus says to go get swords? What about this verse or what about that verse? I'm going to do another video series that we're going to cover all those verses and hopefully give you another look at those verses to see, often how we've used those we use these proof texts to justify violence, how really those texts do not do any such thing. It's just something that we do. And so have twisted those scriptures in a sense. But here we go. But Christ is our ultimate example. How did Christ live? That's the important question. Did he let his enemies kill him? Did he let them stab him, put him on a cross? But you know what? They couldn't defeat him. In the end, he was resurrected. And just like Justin Martyr taught, that even these Christians who are being killed, that God is using those who are watching them. And he's actually planting seeds in them. And they're actually becoming followers of Christ. And so, just a brief summary on Irenaeus. He was linked directly to the apostles. So that means, he's just like with Justin Martyr, he used a lot of these prophecies that were being fulfilled. And so I think it's interesting. There's a lot of commonality between these two. And he talked about how the prophecy was partially fulfilled. There's still Christ coming. There's still going to be him coming and completely fulfilling those scriptures as a glorious coming. All eyes will see And, there's a time when he's coming. But the proof is that Christ has came. And the proof that he's come was that his followers have become nonviolent. They're no longer warring with others. They are turning their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. So Irenaeus connects Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek directly with Isaiah chapter 2, verses 3 through 4, that Jesus' teaching fulfilled the prophecies that were in the Old Testament. So just to note, why is that important right here? He's talking about people who are Marcion. Well, people looked at the Old Testament, or Marcion looked at the Old Testament, and he looked, that God is angry. He wants to kill all the nations. He wants to kill people. He wants to flood the earth. He's an angry, bitter God. But this God in the New Testament is completely different. Well, this shows you, no, it's the same God. Sometimes people make claims against people who believe in nonviolence. Hey, how do you justify the Old Testament when you don't look like you can justify nonviolence and still believe in the Old Testament? Well, yes, and I've already shown you both Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, and I'm going to keep showing you how Christians continually show how the Old Testament is directly linked to nonviolence and the fulfillment of that with the teachings of Jesus Christ. And here we have that again with Isaiah 2, 3, and 4, that this was something that the God in the Old Testament has always loved the Gentiles. He's had a plan for the Gentiles from the very beginning to actually bring them together. Now, step back for 1 second. Look at the Bible, Genesis 1 through 11. That gives the introduction to really how the world got messed up. Covers the fall of man. Covers how we became so wicked that God had to judge the earth with the flood. Then it covers the Tower of Babel, and God said, hey, I want you to scatter out throughout the earth. Mankind rebelled. God showed mercy in that he scattered them out through the earth. That's Genesis 1 through 11. But then look at Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. That's the very beginning when God calls Abraham, and he says, I'm going to bless you, but through you, I'm going to bless all the families of the earth. So it's going to be through Abraham. God's intention the entire time was to bring the Gentiles, all these nations that he had scattered, he's always wanted to bring them back together. He's always wanted to undo, in a sense, that curse. He's always wanted to undo and have a world of people who worship him. And so, looking back at that original design, this is where God's bringing us back to. The days where we were farmers, where we didn't kill one another, where we loved one another. And then Christ is our ultimate example. And it's hard to live this way on this life right now, on this earth right now. But that's what God has done exactly to those who's followed him. He's changing their hearts through the power of Christ, who's living in our lives. He's directing us. He's teaching us. And that was proof that Jesus was the Messiah after the way that his followers lived. So this is very important. This is why nonviolence is important, because it points people to Jesus and to show that he was different. He wasn't like the other false teachers, the other false messiahs. Lots of people claimed to be the Messiah, and they rebelled against Rome, and they ended up being killed by Rome. Nothing happened of their teachings. Their followers went away. But Jesus, he changed people's lives. That was proof that he was the Messiah. Come back. I believe my next couple videos will be over Tertullian. And so, check back with me soon.